When it first happened, I was seeing a bunch of anti-Russian stuff. Some Russians in concert saying, why are we going to war? We're the aggressors. You guys aren't seeing the truth behind this. There was a protest, maybe in Moscow, St. Petersburg, I forget where. But there were these, somewhat biggish Russian protests saying that they should. All that's gone. No one's saying that. I think a bunch of Russians died, and they're all like, you know what? They were dicks for fighting back. Let's go to war.
As someone whose my main focus in my work is freedom of speech, it's a different reason. There's a different reason why you don't see those protests anymore.
You think the Russians are heavy-handed in dealing with those protests?
They're
absolutely they are
very heavy-handed in dealing with those protests. I mean, basically, if you're a journalist and you say something critical about Putin or any of his allies, you tend to you've just passed out one night drunk and froze to death in the middle of the night.
No, not even that. One died last night. You know that, was it a Putin critic?
He got that cancer only my enemies get.
Putin knows sarcoma.
Yeah,
one was killed this week.
One was killed this week.
Yeah, in Washington D.C. there was a
makes it 9 to 14 generals.
In Washington D.C. there was a jumper call, and then they found one of Putin's critics dead on the sidewalk outside of his place in D.C. I think he's a critic or maybe a political opponent. I can't remember.
I wonder if they torture him at all first. Did they just push him off, or is it he got a Glasgow smile, and he Glasgow smiled himself and jumped off a building? Weird.
Shot himself on the way down.
The KGB are very much still the NKVD, they are the KGB. They've just fucking rebranded. It's like the CIA when it's the same people, the same tactics, the same everything. They just changed the sign that was on the door.
Yeah.
And went, we're different now.
July 31st.
It's like, I remember Blackwater, like the mercenary group, they rebranded as the Happy Farm or something. It's still just the mercenary company for hire by any country on earth. It's like, hey, there's a bunch of rebels here. And they're like, yeah, I've heard the Congo's great this time of year. That's what they do.
Well, I mean, the legality of those private companies is kind of weird, but it's not black and white the way, I don't think.
Well, right? They've changed a lot about the laws, but I know Simon Mann, one of the most famous PMCs was Executive Outcomes that he was in charge of, and they operated mainly in Africa. And I actually did a show in London just last month, and he was there. One of the mad lads that I did was there, and I was just sitting chatting away to him. And he's kind of like like Metal Gear Solid. He was kind of like the big boss of Africa for a while. And usually it was government. See how civil wars were happening all the 90s and early 2000s in Africa. Civil wars were happening all
Rwanda and the Congo.
Yeah,
all that stuff happens.
Yeah, he operated a lot of those places, and it was a case of whoever was in charge at the time would say, our army's not good enough because I'm just some warlord from a little fucking village that became president through the last civil war. So they were we need some professionals, and they had a lot of shit ton of fucking money, and they would hire Executive Outcomes, which was fine when it was the government that was hiring them, but Simon Mann ended up getting hired by, try to think of a way to put this delicately, people that were very, very closely connected to the Conservative Party of the United Kingdom, who were in power at the time. And he ended up going to Equatorial Guinea and Africa, and instead of being hired by the government, he was instead hired by people with oil and political connections to overthrow a government. And he went in and did it. However, don't know who, someone snitched on them, and when the plane landed, they were immediately surrounded, seized. He ended up spending 8 years in a fucking Equatorial Guinean prison, which was hell on earth.
That's probably awful.
And it was a dictator, and all that. It was the guy was a dictator. And do you know what he did after it? I remember when Simon told me about this. After he got out of prison, basically there was a trade-off. I don't know what the trade was, but they eventually released him. Simon immediately went back to the UK. He just went, fuck that, I'm staying out of Africa for a while. Went straight back to the UK. He then gets a letter from the dictator in Equatorial Guinea inviting him over for a visit. right? And he's like, you will be completely fine. I'm not going to break any laws or anything. Just come over and let's have dinner. Simon went over, had dinner with the guy, and he's sitting there. And Simon says he thinks it's just a power play. Like the guy's sitting there just eating, going, I could have killed you whenever I wanted, but I didn't. You know, man, like, it was just like a total power play. Like he's just sitting eating steak with a guy that's just kept him in prison in an Equatorial
This is the prison
Guinea
he was in, by the way.
Oh yeah, it's fucking that's what it was.
Fancy.
Oh, sorry, a white guy in an African prison. So,
do you think he was bullied?
He was. His words were something like, "I was not treated very well." So,
an African prison.
Yeah, he's still doing a couple of things over in Africa, because he was telling me I'm not going to repeat what he said. He basically says this, and this. Oh yeah, in the next 5 years, it's going to fucking kick off. We back, baby. So yeah, that's what he's doing now.
I mean, there's plenty of other continents he could go try his luck on. Clearly, Africa's not treating him right.
Oh, it's purely because, like, see in Africa, because the guys in charge, a lot of them are fucking maniacs. Like they'll just go, "Oh, laws, what? Don't you worry about that. Laws and shit. Yeah, don't worry."
I'm sure